This is Dominissimo Voxlore, transmitting on channels carried by the pulse of the greater good. In this broadcast, we recount the saga of the Tau Empire, a people who rose from tribal bloodshed to cast their banners among the stars. This is the tale of unity forged from the Mont'au's anarchy, of fire and earth, air and water, bound beneath ethereal command, of expansions driven through void and war, where Orks, Tyranids, Necrons, and the Imperium itself sought to crush their flame. Strike the seal of subscription, or be cast aside with those who could not endure the patient hunter's snare. Steel your will, guard your creed, and bear witness to this decree. This is the voice of Dominissimo, and this is the law of the Tau Empire. Before they called themselves a starfaring empire, before sleek battlesuits traced white contrails over alien skies, there was only a hard world and a people on the brink of ending themselves. The planet was Tau, a globe of scabbled mesas and wind-flayed plains, copper deserts that rang with dust devils, knife-edged mountains where thin air cut the lungs, and riverlands that braided like metal threads through the bedrock. On this world, clans learned to read the sky for storm signs and the ground for spore. They knapped stone, hammered bronze, discovered powder, shaped rifled barrels. Their eyes faced the horizon because danger always came from there. Their horizons were many, and none of them were kind. Long before the galaxy truly noticed them, a distant, hungry Imperium did. An explorator fleet pierced the veil of the Eastern Fringe and found a promising catalogue entry, a nascent species with a gift for tools and a temperament for order. Voxlogs and Auspex returns spoke of potential uplift or conquest, but the void has its own weather, and the warp closed its fist. Storms rose like mountains of night, strangling supply lines and severing astropathic skeins. The fleet marked the world and turned away, carrying back a line on a star chart and a note: return when the Sea of Souls is calm. The storms did not care for schedules, the Imperium did not come back in time. Without outside conquerors to unify them, the Tau unified around nothing at all. They scattered instead, into plain hunters whose limbs thickened with the work and war, mountain gliders whose frames grew spare and canny, river folk whose hands memorised the language of gears, and caravans who stitched the spaces between with wanderers and words. Trade routes spidered outwards, so did grudges. Every season brought a new refinement: better ploughs, better mills, better muskets, better cannon. Every advance brought a little food and a little safety, and then stole both by making raids faster, sieges longer, and reprisals more complete. The ledger of blood outpaced the ledger of grain. They named the time that followed the Mont'au, the unravelling. It began without ceremony and with a familiar cause. Drought left the riverbed stones hot enough to burn, fever that bloomed in crowded warrens, a winter that didn't end where the calendars said it should. Someone's herd strayed across someone else's border, a warning shot became an exchange of fire, a raid to reclaim became an excuse to take. Villages fortified, towers sprouted like black teeth, cannon smoke hung in the mountain passes, plain skirmishers rode behind the haze, knives low, guns high. The Mont'au was not a single war, but 1,000 wars pretending to be one, because no one had the breath to call them by separate names. Travellers learned to go armed and in groups. Traders learned to go silent and at night. The clever learned to make friends quickly, and to abandon them more quickly still. At Fioton, the river city whose mills sang the loudest and whose foundries burned the hottest, the song turned to a bellow and then to silence. Its walls, thick, steeped, bristling with culverins, went from pride to prison as plains clans rolled up to the parapets and set down camps that grew into scarred rings of earth and timber. The siege began with promises and ended with routines. Dawn bombardments, noon sallies, dusk raids to seize a cart of millet or a barrel of lime. Month laid on month, year broke into year. The city learned to count food ahead and funerals behind. Famine took names and made them past tense. Pestilent learned the streets so well it could navigate blind. The besiegers suffered too, because misery purchased itself on all sides, but their suffering could move. The city could not. No one remembers who saw them first, or perhaps too many claim they did. Two figures walked out of the heat shimmer and dust toward Faltan's battered gates. There were scouts on the walls with rifles cradled, and there were rifles in the camps outside, and both sets ratcheted back their hammers as one. The strangers carried no banners of any clan, wore no cut of armour anyone recognised, and bore no firearms anyone could hear. They asked for entry. The gates did not move. They asked for parley. The camps laughed and drew lots to see who would test the strangers' nerve. The strangers did not flinch. They did not have to be loud. Their presence did the speaking. What happened next is told 20 different ways, and all of them rhyme. The strangers asked to speak to the city's masters. They asked to speak to the war chiefs in the siege lines. They asked to speak with anyone still willing to do something besides kill or be killed. Inside the walls, the voices that answered were hoarse. Outside, the voices were suspicious. So the strangers did not argue. They stepped past the gates and kept walking until they reached the enemy fires. City musketeers shouted themselves hoarse to call them back. Plain outriders lowered their lances and spurred forward, and stopped only because it felt like the right thing to do. The strangers spoke then, not with words like surrender or supremacy, but with a litany that started at the ground and ended at the horizon. They spoke of wells dug and never poisoned, of harvests protected by patrols that did not raid, of roads that led to markets rather than ambush sites. They spoke of each other's clan's strengths as if they'd lived in all of them at once. They spoke as if every lot had been their own. They did not command, they invented. It took an hour for the first weapons to lower, and a day for the first council to convene, and 5 days for the first formal ceasefire to hold without splintering. There were hard men on both sides who wanted to test the strangers with a shot to the head. Those men found their hands heavy and their resolve light. Fear could not be an ally any longer, because the Mont'au had taught them that fear only ate and never built. The strangers were later called Ethereals. In that week, there were simply those who listened, and those who could make enemies listen to one another without losing face. It was enough. The ceasefire widened from ditch to trench, to field to road. Envoys carried terms in both directions: food for quiet, water for safe passage, medical stores for an end to sniping, a shared patrol to prove a point about trust without saying a word. There were breaches, and the Ethereals walked to the places where they happened and spoke until the next day didn't look like the last. The city's cannons fell silent. The siege line's cooking fires burned in the open again because no one feared the smoke would draw a volley. One morning, the gates of Fiaton opened all the way and did not close at dusk. Enemy officers and city masters stood on the same wall and watched a sunset they had previously used for timing their attacks. The Ethereals did not smile, but they allowed themselves to breathe. From Fiaton, the quiet moved like spring ice breaking on the river, first with a sound of strain and then with a rush. The Ethereals left behind them councils that could argue without reaching for powder. They left behind oaths that bound builders to build and warriors to watch. They left behind the idea that skill is not separate from duty. Plains fighters took charge of the perimeter and drilled in open fields. River engineers reopened water wheels and put them to turning mills and then factories. Mountain climbers helped throw cables across ravines and cut steps where there had been only slides. Traders taught the border between lying and bargaining. The Ethereals said that none of these were superior to the others, and all of them were necessary, and this sounded so unlike the Mont'au that people tried it. What ended across the planet did not end in a day. There were holdouts, because there were always men who believed famine is preferable to compromise if it means their badge remains the brightest. The Ethereals walked to those tents too. Some burned away. The new way did not pretend to be magic, it pretended to be possible. Over months, the crack of muskets became a punctuation mark in disputes rather than the only grammar anyone knew. Over years, the Mont'au shrank to a tale told as a warning rather than a report. New songs replaced old laments in the workyards. Babies born to the ceasefire grew into apprentices who believed guard duty and grain duty were two halves of one vow. When at last the city's charters were rewritten and the clan's banners were gathered into a single hall, the Ethereals did not crown themselves. They stood at the back while each craft and company swore to something that did not have a clan name. They called it the greater good, and it was not a prayer or a flag alone, but a promise that the next innovation would not become the next atrocity. The people of Tau had built walls, guns, mills, machines. Under the Mont'au, those things had made them capable of destroying themselves more efficiently. Under the Ethereals, their hands learned a different reflex. The first foundations of a different future took weight. The long night receded. The sunrise was not bright, not yet, but it was steady, and it belonged to everyone who had laid down a weapon and picked up a tool because two strangers had reminded them they could. The silence after the Mont'au was not emptiness. It was the sound of hammers ringing on anvils, of wheels turning where they had once rotted still, of voices speaking in council halls instead of screaming over battlements. The Ethereals had offered a promise of a different kind of life, and the people of Tau began to build toward it with an urgency born from the memory of what they had nearly lost. The word that carried their new covenant was Tau'va, the greater good. It was more than oath, more than slogan. It was an understanding that no one clan, no one skill could stand alone. Every strength was a weakness when isolated. Together, strands could weave into something that would not break. The greater good was not abstract, it was codified in how society itself was arranged. The old tribal divisions, once excuses for feud and bloodshed, were reshaped into castes, each with a defined role in the new order. Those who had fought and hunted upon the plains became the fire caste, the Shahs, whose bodies were hardened by generations of toil, and whose instincts turned naturally toward vigilance and warcraft. The builders and smiths of the river valleys became the earth caste, the Theo, who knew the secrets of stone, ore and agriculture, and could turn raw material into shelter, sustenance and machinery. The mountain dwellers, lean and sharp-eyed, became the air caste, the core, who took naturally to the skies, their light frames suited to high altitudes, and in time, thin voids. The itinerant traders became the water caste, the poor, who could slip easily between disputes, coaxing deals, mending rifts, and turning suspicion into commerce. Over all of them stood the Ethereals, the Aoun, whose authority was unchallenged, not because they demanded it, but because their presence compelled loyalty in a way that defied analysis. At first, these words were written on parchment and edicts carried on wind. What made them more was how they manifested in every day. Farmers once guarded their fields with muskets and watchtowers, now Firecast patrols did the same, freeing hands for ploughing. Smiths once hoarded their knowledge to trade for protection, now Earthcast guilds shared designs openly, because their duty was to all. Caravans once travelled armed to the teeth, now Watercast envoys opened routes under banners of negotiation, with the promise that disputes would be settled not with fire but with arbitration. The Aircast, already adapted to the skies, began building the first true fleets of airships to connect distant valleys and mesas with cargo and messages. And everywhere the Ethereals moved, their very presence reminded all castes that their tasks were threads in the same cloth. Progress followed with breathtaking speed. The Mont'au had been a crucible. Once freed from its pressure, the Tau's ingenuity poured forth. Within decades, powder muskets gave way to pulse-driven weaponry, refined from Earthcast experiments with plasma technology. Airships lengthened and hardened, then broke through the upper atmosphere into orbital craft. The Firecast drilled not only for raids, but for disciplined campaigns, rehearsing tactics on vast plains under ethereal oversight. The Watercast formalised the councils of arbitration into standing assemblies that drafted laws. Within a century of the Mont'au's end, the Tau were no longer a fractured people clinging on to survival, but a civilization setting its gaze on the stars. When their first rockets roared upward, shaking the river valleys with thunder, the people gathered to watch with awe. The Aircast had found their destiny. Soon orbital stations ringed Tau, and telescopes turned outward, hungry. With sublight drives, the first crude interplanetary craft were launched. The moons became training grounds for colonists. Artificial habitats tested how far the Earthcast's ingenuity could stretch. The Ethereals decreed that expansion was not indulgence, but duty, to seek more land for the greater good, to carry unity beyond their cradle. Thus began the first sphere expansion. The first leaps were small, colonies seeded in nearby systems reachable at sublight speeds. Travel was long and perilous, with voyages lasting years, but the Aircast bore it with discipline. The Earthcast built generational craft whose rotating habitats nurtured families during the long sleep of interstellar travel. Firecast garrisons trained in closed holds, waiting for the moment their rifles would defend new soil. Watercast negotiators studied the records of first contact, preparing words as carefully as warriors honed blades. The Ethereals reminded them that each castaway from Tau was an envoy of Tau Var, and failure in the stars would echo at home. New worlds were claimed and seeded with life. Some were harsh, demanding heavy modification, while others welcomed them with fertile plains or oceans brimming with potential. Each colony became a sept, its own hub of culture and governance, bound by loyalty to the Ethereal Council. These septs were not identical, each bore the mark of its caste strengths. One sept might be known for its Firecast legions, another for its Earthcast shipyards, another for its Watercast academies, yet all repeated the same creed: what is mine serves all, and what is yours strengthens me. The Tau did not expand into emptiness. The galaxy was already full. Their first contact with other sapient species came cautiously. When the Tau met the Necrons, a race of wandering mystics who plied the stars in drifting barges, it could have been a moment of conflict. But the Watercast offered alliance instead of fire. The Necrons, blessed with psycho abilities alien to the Tau but eager for kinship, accepted. Their vessels were incorporated into the Tau fleets, and their knowledge was added to the greater good. This was the first of many alliances. The Kroot of Pet came next, feral mercenaries with the unsettling gift of absorbing traits from what they consumed. Where others saw only danger, the Watercast saw potential. The Kroot were fierce hunters, their mercenary ways adaptable to Tau military doctrine. They were offered alliance and trade, and soon their kind fought as auxiliaries beside the fire warriors. The insectoid Vespid, living amid the dense crystalline hives, were another challenge, difficult to communicate with until the Earthcast engineers devised resonance helms to harmonise speech. With these devices, the Vespid were brought into the fold. The greater good grew broader, incorporating not only Tau but those who could be guided by it. Not all were willing. Orks laughed at the Watercast offers and chose to test the Firecast resolve instead. Skirmishes with Greaskins bloodied many young cadres, teaching harsh lessons about resilience and savagery. Other species resisted with equal stubbornness, and when persuasion failed, the Tau learned to enforce compliance with pulse rifle and battlesuit. Yet even in war they sought to avoid extermination. Annexation was preferable to annihilation, because the greater good was meant to be shared. By the close of the first sphere of expansion, the Tau Empire was no longer a planet-bound novelty. They were a constellation, a lattice of septs joined by trade routes and communication relays, each colony feeding and defending the others. The Firecast had become a professional army rather than scattered militias. The Earthcast operated vast shipyards and forges. The Aircast manned fleets that travelled between stars. The Watercast administrated the delicate balance of diplomacy with allies and the coordination of colonies. And the Ethereals remained at the centre, their guidance unquestioned, their presence regarded as the keystone of unity. The memory of the Mont'au still lingered in songs and in the minds of the old, but to the young born in this new age, it was already becoming history, cautionary, distant, a story told around the hearth about a time when the people of the Tau had nearly squandered themselves. Now they looked upward. The first sphere was only the beginning, and the stars beyond still beckoned. The greater good was no longer a dream whispered in the ruins of a city under siege. It was a living empire, carrying its creed from one system to the next, confident that destiny itself would bend to the promise of unity. The Tau'vara had risen, and with it, a civilization that believed it could overcome the galaxy's darkness, not with chains or superstition, but with cooperation and purpose. The first sparks of empire had caught, and the fire was only beginning to spread. The first steps into the stars had been careful ones. Colonies spread by slow sublight voyages, each new sept a candle lit in the void. But candles alone could not push back the darkness forever. The Ethereals and their councils knew that if the greater good was to endure, it needed to grow beyond what the first sphere had offered. The borders were too small, the threats too near, and the hunger of a young empire too strong to be contained. So they turned their gaze outward once again, and the second sphere expansion was born. The Tau had learned much in their first forays beyond their cradle. Sublight journeys had brought them their first allies, their first foes, and their first taste of the scale of the galaxy. But the same slowness that had once been a limitation was now an opportunity. By the time they prepared their next expansion, technology had caught up with ambition. Vast improvements in stasis fields, ship design, and energy conservation meant that voyages once stretching over lifetimes could be completed in decades, even years. For the Aircast, this was liberation. Fleets no longer crawled, they leapt, and with each leap, the promise of the greater good reached farther than before. The second sphere expansion was not only about distance, it was about philosophy. The Ethereals framed it as a grand mission, a charge to carry Tau'var to those who lived in ignorance and suffering. They spoke of worlds enslaved by warlords, of civilizations crumbling under their own feuds, of barren colonies left behind by careless empires. All of them, they said, could be renewed under the light of the greater good. To the Firecast, it was a campaign. To the Earthcast, it was an engineering challenge. To the Watercast, it was the greatest negotiation ever undertaken. And to the people as a whole, it was destiny. The early voyages of the second sphere revealed just how crowded the galaxy truly was. Where the first sphere had mostly encountered small, isolated species, the second brought the Tau into contact with sprawling human colonies scattered on the Imperial fringe. These were worlds left to fend for themselves, abandoned by distant administratum officials or forgotten by the endless bureaucracy of Terra. To the Watercast, these humans were ripe for persuasion. The Tau offered technology beyond anything the settlers could dream of. Clean power grids, efficient weapons, medical advancements, even agricultural methods that doubled harvests in a season. Many human governors found the choice easy. With the Imperium's tithe fleets and patrols absent, why cling to distant masters when a new empire offered prosperity at the doorstep? Those who accepted became Guevesa, human helpers. They took up the creed of the Tau'var, some willingly, some with resignation, but once incorporated they were treated as citizens of the new empire. To the Firecast, Guevesa auxiliaries became a novel tool of war. Squads of humans trained in the Tau doctrine, armed with pulse rifles, fighting alongside fire warriors. To the Watercast, they were proof of concept. If even humans, a species so fractious and violent, could be swayed to the greater good, then surely other races could as well. But for every colony that opened its gate, another slammed them shut. Some humans remembered all too well the Imperium's edicts, Electito Divinitas, the Emperor enthroned as a god. To such minds the Tau were heretics, Xenos to be despised. Others feared imperial reprisal and chose loyalty to distant terror over immediate opportunity. Still others saw in the Tau not saviours but conquerors cloaked in the rhetoric of harmony. Resistance was inevitable. The Firecast learned new lessons here. In the first sphere, they had fought Ork warbands and pirates in scattered engagements. Now, they met organised resistance, human militia regiments, planetary defence forces, and sometimes even rogue Imperial commanders who refused to cede their charges. Entire continents became battlefields where the pulse rifle and the lasgun traded volleys across trenches and ruined cities. The Fire Warriors' discipline, supported by battlesuits that cut across skylines like hunting hawks, often carried the day. Yet the Firecast discovered that humans were stubborn prey. Even poorly armed defenders could bleed an advancing cadre if given wars and desperation. These campaigns forged new heroes and new reputations. On Dal Yith, cadres distinguished themselves with patient couillon tactics, encircling enemy readouts until surrender was the only option. On St. Cyr, fire warriors endured grueling sieges against human guerrillas who used the terrain itself as their ally. Victory was won, but at costs that haunted barracks halls for decades. Each battle fed back into the collective doctrine of the Firecast, shaping them into a force no longer solely for defence, but by conquest tempered with precision. Meanwhile, the Watercast refined its craft. They learned to read human customs, to mirror their languages, to appeal to their hopes. Some envoys became legends for turning entire colonies with word alone, swaying governors with visions of prosperity under the Tau rather than obscurity under the Imperium. These triumphs were not always bloodless. The Imperium did not ignore what was happening on its borders. Administratum scribes noted worlds defecting, and in time, reports reached segmentum commands. The Imperium stirred, slowly but inevitably, and the shadow of its vengeance lengthened. But the Second Sphere was not only about humans. The Tau continued to draw other species into their coalition. More Kroot clans were bound by pact, their kind becoming indispensable shock troops. Vespid swarms were integrated into strike forces, their crystalline wings flashing in sunlight as they descended with neutron blasters. Lesser-known allies, like the psychic Nakusa or the insectoid Demerug, added ships and soldiers to the cause. Each integration broadened the Empire, not just in military might but in ideology. The Tau vow was shown to be flexible, able to encompass species widely different from the Tau themselves. This was no empire of assimilation by blood, but a coalition by creed, or so the Ethereals claimed. In truth, not every alliance was equal. The Ethereals and the caste of the Tau Prime remained dominant, directing the course of expansion. Auxiliaries were honoured, but always subordinate, and when species resisted too strongly, the rhetoric of harmony gave way to the reality of pulsefire. Still, the image endured, a young empire that grew not through slaughter but through promise, an alternative to the oppression and decay of the Imperium. For every human world bombarded into compliance, another was won with gifts of medicine and clean water. For every Orc settlement purged with fire, another alien ally would be welcomed into the fold. By the height of the Second Sphere, the map of the Eastern Fringe glittered with new seps. The Empire's reach had tripled, its fleets patrolling farther than ever before. Trade routes hummed with activity. Nakasa drifters towed cargo trains, Kroot war spheres escorted convoys, Tau warships gleamed under starlight. The Earthcast churned out ever more sophisticated technologies, while the Aircast expanded their mastery of orbital stations and long-range travel. The Empire was no longer a curiosity on the edge of the galaxy, it was a power in its own right, small by the scale of the Imperium, but vibrant and growing. The Ethereal Supreme, Unvar, presided over this flowering like a patient gardener. His proclamations carried across seps, reminding every caste and every ally that their sacrifices served the greater good. He urged caution in the face of Imperial scrutiny, warning that humanity's wrath could be catastrophic if provoked too soon. But even the Unvar's words could not halt momentum. Expansion was not just strategy, it was spirit. The Tau believed themselves chosen by destiny to bring order where others sowed only chaos. And yet, destiny is a double-edged blade. Every world that joined the greater good, willingly or by force, another spark to draw the Imperium's gaze. Every Guevesa regiment raised was another act of defiance against the God Emperor's rule. Every trade convoy between Tau sets was another entry in the Administratum's ledgers of heresy. The Second Sphere had brought the Tau to a new height, but it had also set the stage for their first great trial against the might of mankind. The silence before the storm was deceptive. In the Empire's cities, towers climbed higher, fleets grew larger, and colonies thrived under blue skies. To those that lived in those days, it felt like a dawn of an age without end, but to the Imperium of Man, it was like a contagion creeping at the edge of its dominion. Soon, the two would meet not across negotiation tables or trade routes, but across battlefields that burn names like Dalyeth and Agrellion into history forever. The Second Sphere had been a triumph, but its success carried with it the seed of war. The Tau believed their Second Sphere had marked the beginning of a destiny unbroken. Worlds had joined them, fleets were strong, and for every foe that turned them away, another knelt to the promise of the greater good. But history is a way of punishing certainty. While the Empire celebrated its rapid growth, the Imperium of Man, vast, ancient, and slow to rouse, finally turned its eye towards the glittering embers of its fringe. And when the Imperium stirred, it stirred with fire and fury. The Eastern Fringe had long been a forgotten corner of the galaxy. Its worlds tithed irregularly, and its governors left to fend for themselves. That neglect had given the Tau their opening, but it also guaranteed that the Imperium's response, when it came, would be brutal. Reports from missionaries, inquisitors, and rogue traders all whispered the same heresy. Human colonies turned to Xenos overlords, bearing their weapons, even fighting in their armies. To the Imperium, this was an infection, alien rot festering in the flesh of mankind, and the cure was a crusade. The Damocles Gulf separated the bulk of the Imperium's domains from the rising Tau Empire, a stretch of hostile, void and unstable trade routes that had shielded the Tau from the full reprisal. But in the year 742.M41, Imperial High Command decreed the Gulf would shield them no longer. Fleet after fleet was gathered, regiments of the Astra Militarum drawn from Hive Worlds, Agri Worlds and Death Worlds alike. To stiffen their resolve, the Imperium called upon its Angels of Death, Space Marines from multiple chapters, including the White Scars, Raven Guard and Ultramarines. Where the Tau saw themselves as a rising power, the Imperium now saw only heresy, and it intended to scour it clean. The crusade began with violence so swift the Tau barely had time to comprehend it. Outlying colonies that had once thought themselves secure were suddenly engulfed by the thunder of Imperial bombardments. Settlements that had been promised centuries of peace under Tau Var burned in hours, their skies blackened with orbital fire. On barren moons, fire-cast cadres fought desperate delaying actions, their pulse rifles sparking bright in the dust, only to be buried beneath waves of tanks and Imperial infantry. The watercast scrambled to sue for peace, but their envoys were silenced by bolter fire and banners of the Aquila planted in the soil where their blood fell. Yet as the Imperium pushed deeper, the nature of the war began to shift. The Tau were no longer fighting scattered skirmishes or isolated uprisings. This was empire against empire, and on their home turf the Tau would not break so easily. The heart of the resistance was the Set world Dalyth, a jewel of commerce and industry, whose teeming cities and jungles became the crucible of the campaign. There, the Firecast mobilised entire armies, supported by towering battlesuits, Kroot mercenary warbands, and Vespid swarms diving like shards of crystal through the sky. Dalyth was no easy conquest, and the Imperium soon discovered that the Tau were far from the naive primitives they had once dismissed. The battles of Dalyth Prime were savage and unrelenting. In the steaming jungles, White Scars bikers roared through thickets and swamps, only to be ambushed by fire warriors melting into the undergrowth, their plasma bursts igniting the foliage around them. In the shattered ruins of Hive cities, Raven Guard melter teams stalked through shadows, cutting down Earthcast technicians before they could activate defence grids, only to be hunted down in turn by crisis suits dropping like thunder from the skies. On the plains, the lumbering might of the Imperial Guard's Lehman Russ tanks clashed with the sleek hammerhead gunships, railguns punching holes through armour while autocannon rounds stitched through the air. The Tau had never fought on such scale before. Every day brought lessons in blood. They learned that humanity's soldiers could endure losses unthinkable to the Firecast, hurling men into the guns again and again until the barrels glowed red. They learned that the Astartes were foes unlike any they had faced, warriors who did not break under ambushes, who closed the distance with terrifying speed, and fought like demigods clad in ceramite. But the Imperium, in turn, learned to respect the precision of the Tau. Pulse fire could strip whole platoons in seconds, coordinated Kalyun tactics could lure even Space Marines into kill zones. For the first time, the Imperium faced an alien race whose technology rivaled their own, whose discipline was not chaos but an order unlike their own grim creed. The war ground into a stalemate. Every Imperial assault was answered by counter-strikes, every gain measured in blocks of ruined cities, every loss a crater full of ash. Casualties mounted in numbers that horrified even the hardened Earthcast record keepers. For the Tau, this was war on a scale beyond imagination, a test not of skirmishes but of civilizations. Yet even as the fighting dragged on, the Ethereals urged calm. They declared that Dalyth was the proving ground for the Tau Var, that endurance here would ensure the survival of the Empire itself. Firecast commanders like Shazo Kaz and others etched their names into legend, directing cadres in acts of valour that turned the tide in one district after another. And then, as suddenly as it began, the storm began to ebb. The Imperium, on the cusp of pushing deeper, halted. Their commanders accepted overtures of ceasefire, allowing their fleets and regiments to withdraw across the Gulf. The Tau, battered but unbowed, watched their enemy retreat in confusion. Had their resistance truly blooded the Imperium so deeply that it chose peace? The truth, which the Ethereal Council learned only later, was darker and larger than the Tau could have imagined. A new terror had risen in the galaxy. Hive Fleet at Behemoth, the first great Tyranid invasion, had entered the Imperium's eastern reaches. The Crusade fleet was not defeated, it was diverted, recalled to fight a greater war for survival against a foe that consumed worlds whole. The Damocles Gulf Crusade ended not with conquest, nor with decisive victory, but with a fragile and unfinished silence. The Imperium had shown that it could reach into Tau space with all the fury of a galaxy-spanning empire. The Tau had shown that they could endure that fury and remain standing. Both sides licked their wounds, and neither considered the matter finished. For the Tau, the Crusade was a revelation. They had faced the Imperium's armies and survived. They had seen the strength of humanity, its sheer numbers and its angels of war, and they had not been annihilated. The Firecast emerged hardened, their doctrines tested and refined. The Earthcast rebuilt and fortified Dalyth, vowing never again to be caught unprepared. The Watercast spun the ceasefire as triumph of diplomacy, declaring that even the Imperium had recognised the wisdom of the greater good, and the Ethereals whispered of destiny, that the greater good could be tested by fire and found unbreakable. But in the shadows of the Empire, another lesson had taken root. Among the commanders who had fought in the Crucible of Dal'yith was a warrior whose brilliance and ferocity had turned the tide time and again. His name was Shazo Viola Shovar Kais Montir, Oshova, whom the galaxy would come to know as Commander Farsight. To his cadres, he was a hero beyond compare. To the Ethereals, he was a blade both sharp and dangerous, one that might one day cut the hand that held it. The Damocles Gulf Crusade had ended. The war had scarred the Tau, but it had also given them something more precious, the knowledge that they were no longer a curiosity at the galaxy's edge. They were now a rival, a foe, a presence that even the Imperium of Man could not ignore. And for the first time, the Tau began to understand what it meant to stand not as children among giants, but as challengers in a galaxy that would never forgive weakness. The Damocles Gulf Crusade had scarred the Empire, but it also elevated names that would echo for generations. Among them, none blazed brighter than Shazo Viola Shovar Kais Montir, known to his warriors simply as Oshovar. He'd been a prodigy even before the Great War, a student of the legendary commander Puretide, master of strategy whose doctrines had shaped the Firecast's entire martial philosophy. Puretide had drilled his students relentlessly, dividing his wisdom into two schools of thought: the Mont'au, the killing blow, a swift and decisive strike to annihilate an enemy's heart, and the Koyon, the patient hunter, a method of waiting, drawing prey into the trap before delivering the killing strike. Shadowsun would one day carry the Koyon as her banner. Farsight, bold and restless, embodied Mont'au. On Dal'yith and across the Crucible of the Crusade, Farsight's talent had been proven again and again. His cadre struck like lightning, appearing where the Imperium least expected, shattering armoured spearheads and cutting command lines before vanishing into the smoke. To his fire warriors, he seemed unstoppable, a commander who saw not only the battlefield as it was, but as it would be a heartbeat later. His victories rallied cadres that might have otherwise have been broken beneath the Imperium's sheer mass. It was no wonder that when the war ended, he was entrusted with one of the greatest responsibilities yet laid upon a Firecast commander: the pursuit and eradication of the Ork menace that still plagued the Empire's fringes. Orks had lingered like a disease after the Crusade, feral warbands raiding border colonies, threatening to undo what the Empire barely secured. The Ethereal Council knew these Orks could not be allowed to gather into another war. They needed to be cut out, root and branch, and who better to wield that blade was Oshova, the Mont'au incarnate. Thus he set out at the head of a great expeditionary force, leading a fleet across the Gulf into wild territory, beyond the reach of immediate aid. His orders were clear: end the Ork threat once and for all. For years, the campaign was a string of victories that became the stuff of legend. Ork warbands were shattered one after another, their hulks torn apart in space, their strongholds burned out on barren moons. Farsight's forces learned to anticipate Ork cunning, to blunt their savage charges with disciplined fire, to deny them the satisfaction of close quarters. Each battle added to his fame and his troops' loyalty. Where the Ethereals were distant voices of philosophy, Oshovar was there, in the mud, in the gunfire, leading from the front. The fire warriors of the expedition began to look at him not as a commander, but as the embodiment of what it meant to fight for survival and victory. It might have ended there, with Oshovar returning home triumphant, another hero of the Firecast draped in honours. But fate had a much darker course in store, one that neither he nor the Ethereals could foresee. On a desolate world called Arthur's Moloch, the expedition uncovered ruins unlike anything the Tau had ever seen. Temples scarred with ancient sigils, stones blackened as if by fire that had never gone out, and artefacts that hung with power both alluring and malignant. The Tau, with no knowledge of the war called the demonic, did not understand what they walked into. They would learn brutality in the span of a single night. The attack came without warning. Gates that were not gates split open across the ruins, and from them poured beings of nightmare, red-skinned, blade-wielding horrors that shrieked with voices that clawed at the mind. They fell upon the Tau with a savagery unmatched even by the Orks. Fire warriors broke ranks, not from cowardice but the sheer incomprehension. How could one fight creatures that bled fire, that laughed as plasma tore through them only to knit back together? The crew auxiliaries fought savagely, but their flesh was torn apart faster than it could adapt. Worst of all, the Ethereals accompanying the force were slaughtered within moments, their presence no shield against such alien horror. For Farsight, the battle was a revelation written in blood. All his life he had believed the Ethereals' word that the universe was material, tangible, something that could be measured and mastered with reason and unity. Arthur's Moloch shattered that illusion. He saw with his own eyes a realm of monsters that should not exist, spilling into reality with hunger beyond reason. He fought like a cornered animal, wielding every weapon he could find, rallying the remnants of his cadres into desperate firebreaks. But the demons kept coming, inexhaustible, endless. And then, in the hearts of the ruin, he found it. An ancient blade, longer than any Tau weapon, its surface rippling with a strange alien sheen. The Dawn Blade. To this day, its origin is uncertain. Some claim it is an artifact of the Necrons, others that it is a relic of a civilization predating even them. What mattered in the moment that it was the only weapon that seemed to bite deep into demonic hordes. Farsight seized it, and with it he carved a path through the enemy, striking at the warp-rent portals themselves. With each blow, the gateways shrieked and buckled until at last they collapsed, banishing the horrors back into whatever hell they spawned from. The Tau lived, but not unchanged. In the aftermath, the expedition was broken, its Ethereals gone, its warriors bloodied and traumatised. But more lasting than wounds or losses was the doubt that had taken root in Oshova's heart. He had seen what the Ethereals had never told them existed. He had felt the strangeness of the Dawn Blade, a weapon that seemed to steal time itself, granting him a lifespan unnaturally long. He began to wonder, what else had the Ethereals concealed? Why had they never spoken of demons, of the warp, of the dangers that now seemed woven into the very galaxy? Was their rule not guidance, but control? When orders came for him to return to the Empire, Oshova refused. His forces, bound to him by loyalty and survival, refused with him. They turned their ships not homeward, but outward, claiming the very territory they had fought across as their own. These became the Farsight enclaves, Tau colonies beyond the Gulf, bound not by the authority of the Ethereal Council, but by the leadership of Oshova and those who followed him. To the Empire, this was treachery. The Ethereals declared him an outcast, a warning of the dangers of ambition and hubris. His name was struck from records, his example cited as the path of ruin. Yet among Firecast veterans, his legend only grew. Here was a commander who had fought demons and lived, who had cast off the leash of the Ethereals and carved his own destiny. Even whispers of his immortality spread. How could one Tau live centuries beyond the lifespan of his kind, unless the Dawnblade itself had bound him to fate? From the enclaves, Oshova waged endless war against the Orks, holding back their tide in what became known as the War of Daka, a conflict that still rages. He ruled alongside his most trusted lieutenants, the Eight, each a veteran commander with their own legend. Together, they forged a society still loyal to the greater good, but on Oshova's terms. A greater good without Ethereals, one that prized strength, independence, and survival above obedience. In the halls of the Empire, his name was spoken only as a warning. In the barracks of the Firecast, it was spoken in awe. Farsight had become more than a commander. He was a question made flesh. What if the Ethereals were not the infallible guides they claimed to be? What if the greater good could be interpreted another way? And what if, in the face of horrors like those on Arthas Moloch, only a warrior's blade could truly keep the Tau alive? The Tau Emperor had survived the Crusade, but in the shadow of Farsight's exile, another truth emerged. Their unity was not unbreakable. A fracture had opened, not of borders or colonies, but of belief. And as long as Farsight lived, and he lived still, far beyond the ears of any Tau should, the question he embodied would haunt the Empire. Was loyalty to the Ethereals the greater good? Or was the greater good something larger? Something a renegade commander could carry in his own hands, beneath alien stars, with a stolen blade that gleamed like the dawn? The loss of Farsight had shaken the Tau Empire. For the first time since the Ethereals had bound their people together, unity had cracked. The Council declared him an exile, a heretic, a cautionary tale. But to soldiers who fought under him, to cadres who had lived because of his brilliance, whispers of admiration lingered like smoke. The Ethereals redoubled their efforts to project certainty, to declare that the Tau remained unscathed, that no single commander could weaken what had been built. And just as they sought to quiet dissent, the galaxy reminded them that fractures within were the least of their dangers. Because while the Tau were young, the galaxy was old and full of predators. The first Great Shadow came not from within their borders, nor even from the Imperium they had only just fought to bloody stalemate, but from beyond the stars themselves. In the year 899.M41, skies above Tau's set worlds burned with unfamiliar signatures. At first, they thought them the returning war fleets of the humans. Instead, what descended was something altogether alien, faster, hungrier, and more horrifying than anything the Tau had faced. High Fleet Gorgon had come. The Tyranids were not like the Orks, whose savagery at least carried a kind of brutal logic. They were not like humans, driven by ideology or stubborn pride. They were not even like the demons Farsight had fought on Arthas Moloch, creatures of nightmare that could be banished. The Tyranids were appetite made flesh, an endless swarm whose only strategy was adaptation, whose only purpose was consumption. When they struck, it was like a storm that learned with every lightning bolt it threw. The first colonies they devoured vanished almost overnight, their biomass stripped clean, their oceans drunk dry, their soil reduced to dust. Firecast cadres fought valiantly, railguns and plasma rifles cutting down rivers of chitin and claw, but every victory was fleeting. Where one bioform was slain, another would arrive with armour thicker, spines sharper, sinews tougher against the very weapon that killed its kin. The Tau had never faced an enemy that could learn faster than they could innovate, but here it was, a predator that shifted between each engagement as if mocking their ingenuity. The Council declared a state of empire-wide emergency, Sept fleets converged, Kroot auxiliaries joined the fray with their feral savagery, and even the Guavesa regiments took up arms alongside their Tau masters. Yet even united they found themselves driven back. The war against Gorgon was not one of clean victories but of desperate holding actions, where cadres sacrificed themselves by the hundred to buy a single day for evacuation. Entire Sept worlds were written off as lost, their populations sacrificed so that others might endure. For a people who believed in harmony and preservation, it was a nightmare come true. And then something unthinkable happened. The Tau fought beside the Imperium. It was necessity, not alliance, that forged this brief moment. Imperial Guard regiments stationed on threatened human worlds saw the horror that came falling from the skies and realised neither human lasgun nor Tau pulse rifle alone could stand against it. In scattered battles, guardsmen and fire warriors found themselves firing from the same barricades, covering one another's retreats, even sharing rations when supply lines broke. There was no love in it, no friendship, only the shared knowledge that to fight separately was to die. It was enough. Together, bleeding from every wound, they slowed the advance. Railguns learned to target synapse creatures, las cannons found their mark against monstrous biotitans, and massed artillery hammered brood after brood into slurry. After years of attrition, High Fleet Gorgon was finally broken. It did not retreat, it was annihilated, forced into extinction by a coalition that despised itself even as it survived. The cost, however, was staggering. Tau Septs were left crippled, thousands of lives lost, entire colonies erased. The lesson was seared into the minds of every caste. The Tyranids would come again, and next time, survival might not be possible. No sooner had the Tau begun to recover from this brush with extinction than another ancient nightmare stirred. On the world of Malbed, in 936.M41, Earth-caste prospectors unearthed ruins beneath the planet's crust, vast black structures that pulsed with silent menace. They did not know it then, but they had trespassed upon tombs of the Necrons, the galaxy's oldest machines of death. When the first obsidian monolith rose from the ground, when its emerald beams began carving through vehicles and bunkers alike, the Tau understood only they had wakened something beyond their reckoning. As if fate had a cruel sense of humour, it was not only the Tau who had come to Malbed. Imperial forces, led by none other than Marinus Calgar of the Ultramarines, were already clashing with Tau colonists when the Necrons rose. Enemies turned allies in the space of a heartbeat. Tau battlesuits and Space Marine squads fighting shoulder to shoulder against undying legions of living metal. Plasma bolts and bolter rounds ricocheted uselessly off Necron hulls, only to find purchase when combined in coordinated volleys. It was a strange sight. Guavesa humans fighting beneath the banner of the greater good alongside their Imperial kin, both shouting orders across battle lines where yesterday they had tried to kill one another. Even stranger still was Calgar's decision, once the Necron threat had been contained, to permit the surviving Tau to withdraw in peace. The Ultramarines enacted exterminatus on Malbed, burning the tomb wood clean, but they allowed their former foes to escape first. For a single fleeting moment, there had been respect in the eyes of humanity's champions. The Necron awakening was a different kind of warning. Unlike the Tyranids, who consumed, the Necrons endured. They were ancient, patient, and indestructible, rising in numbers the Tau could barely comprehend. The Empire had entered a galaxy where even the ground beneath their feet might hold armies older than the stars. The lesson was bitter. There were threats no amount of diplomacy, no promise of greater good, could ever sway. And still, the galaxy gave no reprieve. In the years that followed, Space Marine chapters descended on Tau worlds in punitive raids, none fiercer than the Space Wolves. On the ocean planet of Cavarium Alpha, the Tau fought a battle unlike any they had faced before, running firefights across waves and reefs, ambushes set in the depths where stealth-suited warriors clashed with wolves who swam through black waters like predators of old Fenris. It was a defeat. The Tau withdrew, scarred by the reminder that against humanity's finest, even their finest technology could falter. By the dawn of the 10th century of M41, the Tau Empire bore wounds deeper than any war of expansion had ever cut. They had survived Orks, survived the Imperium, survived Tyranids and Necrons, even demonic incursions in distant legends. But each survival had been costly. Their borders held, but they were no longer naive. The galaxy was vast, cruel, and unyielding. It did not matter that they came with offers of trade, prosperity, or unity. To the stars, they were merely another rival, another prey, another empire rising too quickly. Yet the Ethereals refused to spare. They declared the survival of the Tau through such trials a sign of destiny fulfilled. They proclaimed that even the hungers of alien monsters, even the undying legions of ancient kings, could not undo Tau Va. For the Firecaste, it meant only that their vigilance could never waver. For the Earthcaste, it was proof that innovation must accelerate, new weapons forged faster than threats could adapt. For the Watercaste, it was a reminder that allies were as fleeting as enemies, but both could be tools if wielded with care. The Empire stood scarred but alive, and in the distance, another storm was already gathering. Orks were massing again, more numerous than before, and the Ethereal Council knew that survival would demand something greater than endurance. It would demand new champions, new doctrines, and the rekindling of hope where the green tide threatened to drown the stars. The Tau had glimpsed the galaxy's true face, and it was a mask of horror. But they would not turn away. They would stare into it, adapt, and declare the same resolve they had clung on to since the end of the Mont'au, that the greater good was not a dream to be abandoned, but a light to be carried forward, even against shadows that stretched from one end of the galaxy to the other. It began at the fringes, as it often does, outlying Sept colonies sending frantic communiques, swarms of crewed ships breaching the void, settlements razed, skies blackened by drop barges that fell like meteors. The Tau had fought Orks before, had beaten them in skirmishes and border wars, but these were more than raids. Survivors described not one warlord but dozens, each leading a warband fast enough to flatten a Sept on its own, and where Orks meet in number, they fight one another until only the strongest remain, or until they find a greater enemy to crush. The Tau were about to become that enemy. From the Western Vale Nebula, the war erupted. Ork fleets, a riot of jagged hulls and roaring engines, surged across the stars. Their sheer scale defied Tau logistics. Tens of thousands of ships, each a cobbled monstrosity bristling with guns, carried green hordes eager for slaughter. They slammed into the frontier worlds like a hammer, and entire colonies disappeared beneath the flood. To the Tau, this was not merely invasion, it was annihilation on the march. The Ethereal Supreme, Onvar, convened the highest councils of the Empire. Reports painted a grim picture. No Sept could stand alone against the green tide. Defeat in detail was inevitable unless the Empire acted as one. In that council chamber, Onvar uttered the words that would become etched into history. This would not be remembered as a war of survival, but as a war of confederation. Every Sept, every caste, every ally would fight not as fragments, but as one body, one purpose, one greater good. The strategy was as audacious as it was desperate. The vanguard Septs closest to the invasion, Viola, Sacia, and Tauan, were ordered to hold the line, to bleed the Orks with delaying tactics. Reinforcements from distant Septs would be rushed to their aid, not piecemeal, but in waves, creating a rolling front that would stretch across dozens of systems. The Aircaste would coordinate not only Starfleets, but the largest logistical effort in Tau history. Entire networks of supply chains to keep the Firecaste armed and fed, the Earthcaste repairing what was shattered, the Watercaste brokering unity between alien auxiliaries who might otherwise have fled. The first blows fell hard. On frontier moons, Firewire cadres dug into trenches, holding until their pulse carbines overheated and their ammunition ran dry, only to be buried under green avalanches. On the ground, Ork mobs stormed like tidal waves, bellowing with joy as they met disciplined volleys. Railguns blasted holes through stompers, only for the wrecks to become cover for more Orks surging forward. In orbit, crewed Ork cruisers rammed Tau starships, spilling mobs of boys into corridors where combat became a brawl of bayonets and claws. Losses were staggering. For every Ork corpse burned to ash, 10 more seemed to rise. But the Tau were not fighting as they once had. Every sacrifice bought time, and every hour was precious. Reinforcements converged, fleets gathered, and cadres from sets that had never fought side by side found themselves brothers in arms. Croup kindreds fought like wild beasts, ambushing Orks in jungles and devouring their flesh to adapt resilience. Vespid wings swooped through canyons, neutron blasters crackling as Ork convoys erupted beneath them. Even the Guavesa, human auxiliaries once mistrusted by many, stood shoulder to shoulder with fire warriors, proving that their loyalty to the greater good was written in blood, not just treaties. Still, the tide threatened to break them. In one battle after another, Tau commanders reported victories only by retreat. Cities became fortresses, fortresses became ruins, ruins became mass graves. Onvar, however, remained unyielding. From his dais he declared that this was the Empire's crucible, that the greater good itself was being tested, and that unity would be their salvation. But words alone could not turn the tide. The Empire needed more than faith, it needed a saviour. That saviour came from the cold embrace of stasis. Decades earlier, Farsight had driven the Ethereals to preserve their greatest commanders in cryogenic sleep, knowing that the day might come when the Empire would require brilliance beyond the reach of any ordinary leader. Among those sleepers was Shaz-O-Shazira, Commander Shadowsun, a student of Puretide like Farsight before her. She was his opposite in temperament and doctrine. Where Oshovar embodied Mont'au, she embodied Kayun, the patient hunter, a strategist who could turn patience into a weapon sharper than any blade. As the Orktide threatened to drown the Empire, the Ethereals awakened her. Shadowsun stepped from stasis not into the world she remembered, but into one aflame. Her arrival on the battlefield was not heralded by speeches, but by silence broken by victory. She struck not where the Orc was strongest, but where they were blind. Her forces lured entire mobs into valleys seeded with hidden fire teams, railguns waiting like coiled serpents. She feigned retreats, only to spring traps that collapsed cliffs upon her pursuers. She deployed stealth teams into the heart of Orc encampments, detonating ammunition stockpiles that turned night into day. The Orcs, ever hungry for direct combat, found themselves clashing ghosts and bleeding for it. For 12 long years the war raged. Shadowsun became its icon, her white armoured battlesuit a beacon to fire warriors who had lost hope. Across Seps, her name was whispered with awe. She was not only a commander, she was proof that the Empire could outthink the barbarism of the galaxy. Under her guidance, the Orktide began to falter. Their fleets, once unstoppable, were shattered in ambushes among the asteroid fields. Their hordes, once united, broke apart into rival warbands, easy prey for coordinated Tau strikes. Slowly, painfully, the green tide receded. When the last war boss fell, the Empire stood bloody but unbroken. The Orcs had been defeated, their war splintered into fragments too small to threaten the Empire again, at least for some time. The cost had been monumental. Worlds lost, cadres annihilated, countless lives consumed in the furnace of war. But the Empire had not shattered. Instead, it had bound itself tighter. The Kroot, the Vespid, even the Gwavesa emerged as indispensable allies. The Seps that had once competed for resources now fought as a confederation, their destinies woven together by fire. The Ethereals proclaimed it a triumph of Tau-Va, proof that unity could withstand even the most barbaric of foes. The Firecast whispered another truth, that without Shadowsun, they might have fallen. She was elevated as the heroine of the Third Sphere, the commander who had inherited Puretide's wisdom and surpassed it. And though the Empire rejoiced, in the quiet corners of strategy halls, the lesson was clear. The galaxy would never stop testing them. Today it had been Orks, tomorrow it would be someone else. But for the moment, the Tau allowed themselves to believe. They had stared down the greatest war in their history and lived. The Great War of Confederation had bound themselves together as never before. And in the calm after the storm, they turned their eyes outward once more. Expansion had not halted, it was reborn. For if they could defeat the Green Tide, what could possibly stop the destiny of the greater good? The Orc War had receded at last, leaving the Empire scarred but alive. For 12 bitter years, the Tau had fought tooth and nail to stave off extinction. And when the smoke cleared, they found themselves something more than survivors. They were united as never before, the auxiliaries bound by blood and sacrifice, their Seps no longer isolated constellations of loyalty, but a true confederation. The Ethereals, ever masters of the narrative, seized upon this moment to declare that the greater good had been vindicated in fire. They proclaimed that the time had come not for retreat, not for rebuilding alone, but for the boldest step yet, a new surge into the stars. Thus, the Third Sphere expansion was born. From the outset, it was to be different from those that had been before. The First Sphere had been cautious, a testing of wings. The second had been ambitious but reckless, inviting the wrath of the Imperium and giving rise to the crucible of the Damocles Gulf Crusade. The third would be something else entirely, a declaration that the Tau Empire was no longer a fragile upstart, but a true rival to any power in the galaxy. This was not an age of small, careful colonies, it was an era of conquest. And at its heart was Commander Shadowsun. She had emerged from stasis into the maelstrom of the Orc War, and through patience and brilliance, had delivered her people. Now the Ethereals placed her at the tip of the spear, supreme commander of the expansion. Where Farsight had been the Mont'au given form, she was the Kayun incarnate, the hunter who waits, who lures, who strikes where the enemy is weakest. Her reputation was unshakable, her victories undeniable. Across the Empire, she was hailed as the heroine of a new age. The Third Sphere launched in 997.M41 with a ferocity that stunned even its architects. Entire fleets surged across the Damocles Gulf, no longer timid of its dangers. Colonisation ships bristling with earth-cast engineers and water-cast envoys followed in the wake of the war fleets. Each new conquest swiftly seeded with the Tau settlers and auxiliaries. Shadowsun's strategy was not blunt force invasion. She understood that the Imperium, vast as it was, could not respond everywhere at once. Instead, she struck like a scalpel, identifying worlds whose defences were light, whose governors were isolated, whose populations were weary of neglect. When resistance appeared strong, she bypassed it, letting the Imperium waste its resources on bastions while she captured the arteries of entire sectors. It worked with devastating efficiency. Imperial outposts, accustomed to little more than pirate raiders, found themselves overwhelmed in days. Local defence forces broke against disciplined firewire cadres and railgun bombardments. Entire planets swore allegiance before a shot was fired, seduced by the promise of technology and prosperity. Others fell under fire, their defenders cut down by crisis suit drops that landed with surgical precisions in the heart of command centres. Shadowsun's doctrine was speed, precision and shock, so rapid that the Imperium had no chance to marshal a coherent response. At the height of its expansion, the Tau seized a prize that seemed unthinkable, Agrellion. This hive world, heavily populated and a keystone of the Imperium's frontier, should have been impregnable. Yet Shadowsun treated it not as a fortress to besiege, but as a prey to outmaneuver. She bypassed its outer bastions early, striking at supply lines and command hubs with surgical precision. Within a single day, 12 great hive cities fell into chaos. Administratum offices burned, Arbites barracks collapsed under precise demolitions, and Vox relays were silenced before the Imperium even knew where to respond. By nightfall, Agrellion was in Tau hands. The world was swiftly renamed Mugalath Bay, a declaration that would no longer be a jewel of the Imperium but a beacon of the greater good. The Tau wasted no time in reshaping it. Earthcast labourers retooled Manufactura, Watercast envoys brought human defectors into the fold, and Firecast garrisons erected gleaming citadels above the ruins of Imperial precincts. For the first time, the Empire held not just outlying colonies, but a true hive world, the very heart of human industry. It was a conquest that sent shockwaves through both empires. To the Tau, it was proof of destiny. To the Imperium, it was heresy beyond tolerance. Nor was Agrellion the only gain. New septs were founded in rapid succession. Simian and Furios rose as centres of commerce and military strength, their banners unfurled as symbols of the Tau permanence in lands that had once been human. Everywhere, Shadowsun's name was invoked with reverence. She was the patient hunter who had outwitted the Imperium itself. Ethereal orators declared that her strategies embodied the Tau of A, that her victories proved the inevitability of their cause. For a brief, brilliant moment, it seemed nothing could halt their expansion. Yet for all her brilliance, Shadowsun knew the truth that propaganda did not. The Imperium was slow to respond, but when it did, its vengeance would be apocalyptic. She pressed her expansion forward with urgency, knowing that each world taken would fortify the Empire for the storm to come. She prepared layered defences, fortified sept capitals, and stockpiled supplies. She urged the Ethereals to prepare for war unlike any they had seen. For all her victories, Shadowsun was not blinded by triumph. She had fought too long to mistake the Imperium's silence for weakness. Within the Empire, morale soared. The Firecast revelled in their triumphs, emboldened by the belief that no foe could resist their disciplined unity. The Earthcast toured ceaselessly, producing battlesuits and starships at unprecedented rates, proud to see their designs tested and vindicated in war. The Watercast swelled with confidence, their diplomacy made easier by success. Species that had once hesitated now clamoured to join a coalition that could take hive worlds from humanity. Even the auxiliaries found themselves elevated, their contributions celebrated as proof of the greater good's inclusiveness. For a people so young, the Third Sphere felt like proof that the stars themselves were bending toward their vision. But in the quiet halls of the Ethereal Council, there was unease. They remembered the Second Sphere and the Damocles Crusade. They remembered how swiftly the Imperium could respond once it chose to. They knew Shadowsun's victories, however dazzling, had painted a target on the heart of their empire. And they knew too that history had a way of turning triumph into tragedy. For the moment though, none of that mattered. To the Tau, the galaxy had been remade. Where once they had been a fledgling people clawing their way out of the Mont'au, now they stood as conquerors, their fleets sweeping across sectors, their banners raised over hive spires, their vision of unity spreading farther than ever before. The Third Sphere expansion was not simply another campaign, it was a statement to the galaxy itself. The greater good was no longer a dream whispered on Tau, it was reality, etched in fire and steel across the stars. And as Shadowsun stood at the helm of their fleets, her mind already on the reprisals she would knew come, she allowed herself one fleeting moment of pride. The patient hunter had laid her traps well, and for now, the prey of the galaxy was ensnared. But the galaxy is a cruel place, and prey has a way of becoming predator when provoked. The Imperium of Man had not forgotten Agrellion, nor Mugalath Bay. nor the insult to its pride. Its silence was not surrender, it was the pause before a storm. And when that storm came, it would test not only Shadowsun, but the very soul of the greater good. The Third Sphere expansion had been ablaze across the stars, dazzling in its speed and shocking in its scale. To the Tau, it felt like vindication, proof that the greater good could not only endure the galaxy's savageries, but triumph over them. Yet every conquest carries a shadow, and with every Imperial world annexed, with each hive brought into the fold, the shadow lengthened. The Imperium of Man does not forgive insult, and it does not forget defeat. The silence that followed Shadowsun's lightning victories was not weakness, it was the drawing of a breath before the roar. The first rumble came not with cataclysmic fleets, but with a single world, Taros. Taros was, by Imperial measure, an unremarkable planet, a desert world, parched and windswept. Its value lay in the mineral wealth beneath its crust, wealth that fueled distant forges and paid Imperial tithes. But over centuries, neglect and mismanagement had driven its people to bitterness. When the watercasts arrived, they did not come with warships first, but with words. They promised desalination plants to turn salt flats into reservoirs, atmospheric processors to temper the burning winds, medicines to banish sickness, and weapons to defend themselves. To people forgotten by the Administratum, these gifts were salvation. Without a shot fired, Taros pledged itself to the greater good. To the Imperium, it was betrayal. To the Tau, it was proof that philosophy could achieve what fleets could not. But the moment Taros raised the banner of the greater good, its fate was sealed. In 998.M41, the Imperium unleashed a retribution force, the 4,621st Imperial Guard Army, supported by Astartes contingents and Mechanicus cohorts. They descended on Taros in thunder, expecting a simple purge of Xenos collaborators. Instead, they found a world transformed. Earthcast engineers had turned the barren waste into fortress networks, with hidden strongpoints buried beneath dunes, railgun turrets disguised as cliff faces, and ambush sites mapped to the last grain of sand. Firecast cadres lay in wait, their pulse carbines tuned for desert warfare. Croup mercenaries stalked the canyons, blending into the heat haze before striking at supply columns. Even human Gavesa regiments, former Imperial citizens, took up arms against their one-time masters. The war for Taros was a grinding attritional nightmare. Imperial tanks lumbered across endless dunes, their engines choked with grit, only to be picked off by hammerheads striking from concealed ridgelines. Drop pods screamed through the atmosphere, disgorging space marines into the mist of Tau's positions, only for crisis suits to descend in response, their jetpacks roaring as plasma fire lit the night. In city ruins, guardsmen fought house to house against fire warriors who refused to yield an inch. What should have been swift retribution turned into a quagmire. Months dragged into years. The tower prepared too well, the terrain favoured their technology, and Imperial logistics faltered under the desert's merciless hand. Food rotted, water ran short, tempers flared. In the end, the Imperium withdrew, bloodied and humiliated. Taros remained Tau, renamed Tyros, a symbol of defiance. To the Empire, it was a triumph, proof that when even humanity came in force, the greater good could prevail. To the Imperium, it was a wound to pride that demanded vengeance. That vengeance came with the fury of a storm, and its name was Agrelion, Magulath Bay. The fall of Agrelion to Shadowsun had been the crown jewel of the Third Sphere, a hive world seized in a single day, its manufactura and spires turned into banners of Tau supremacy. To lose such a world was a humiliation the Imperium could not tolerate. So in 999.M41, it struck back with a ferocity unmatched in Tau history. This was no scattered punitive raid, it was an orchestrated campaign, a task force assembled from Segmentum Pacifus and beyond. Entire regiments of the Astra Militarum, drawn from death worlds and hive spires alike, marched beneath banners of vengeance. Scutari maniples and engines of the Adeptus Mechanicus strode alongside them, titans blotting out the horizon. From the skies came the elite scions, storming into battle with grav shoots blazing, and with them the Adeptus Astartes, chapters of the Raven Guard, White Scars and others, their gene-forged warriors sworn to purge the shame of Agrelion's loss. The Imperium did not come to reconquer, it came to annihilate. The opening bombardments tore through Tau orbital defences, smashing platforms and scattering fleets. When Imperial boots touched the ground, the world became a furnace. Hive cities that had fallen in hours now became killing fields. Streets ran with fire as Tau and Imperial forces clashed block by block, neither yielding, neither offering a quarter. Fire warriors set ambushes in manufactura corridors, only for them to be flushed out by flamers and frag grenades. Crisis suits traded shots with the land speeders and the aerial duels above rooftops. Kroot kindreds, their quills slick with gore, fought hand to hand against chainsaws, their war cries mingling with the howls of space marines. Shadowsun herself directed the defence, her mind a map of endless contingencies. She turned entire districts into traps, allowing the Imperium to advance before sealing them off with hidden teams. She cut supply lines, collapsed bridges, and unleashed stealth teams to strike at command centres. Her strategies bled the invaders, but even she could not stem the tide. For every Imperial column shattered, another emerged. For every Astarte squad cut down, another drop pod roared from the sky. And amidst this storm came tragedy. Var, Ethereal Supreme, had travelled to the war zone, intent on inspiring his people at the heart of their greatest triumph. Instead, he became their greatest loss. In the chaos of battle, a Culexus assassin infiltrated the command sanctum. Silent, soulless, a null presence that even the Tau could sense as dread, it struck swiftly. Var was slain, his bodyguards cut down, his presence extinguished in a moment. The Empire's spiritual core had been ripped away. The shock was seismic. To lose the Supreme Ethereal in the midst of war should have broken the Empire's will. But instead, something extraordinary happened. As Imperial forces pressed deeper, as hive after hive burned, the defences stiffened. Shadowsun fought harder, her strategy sharper, as though fuelled by grief. And from beyond the gulf, an unexpected figure arrived. Oshovar, Commander Farsight. The exile, the traitor, the forbidden name, appeared at the head of Enclave warriors, crimson battlesuits cutting into Imperial flanks. His intervention stunned both sides, breaking the Imperium's momentum and giving Shadowsun the breathing space to orchestrate evacuations. The war ended not with victory, but with fire. Unable to fully reclaim Agrellion, the Imperium chose to deny it to anyone. Exterminator's protocols were enacted, orbital bombardments rained down, firestorms engulfed the hives, oceans bored away. Morgulath Bay became a wasteland, its promise reduced to cinders. Shadowsun withdrew with what forces she could save, and the Enclaves departed as suddenly as they had arrived, and the Imperium declared its vengeance fulfilled. For the Tau, it was devastation. The jewel of the Third Sphere was gone, their Ethereal Supreme slain, their triumph marred by catastrophe. Yet the Ethereal Council moved swiftly to preserve unity. They concealed the truth of Var's death, replacing him with a simulacrum, an artificial construct that mimicked his presence, his voice, his visage. To the Empire's citizens, Var still lived, still guided them, still embodied the Tau Va. To the Council, it was a necessary lie, a shield against despair. The lessons of Taros and Morgulath Bay were etched in fire. The Tau had learned that their victories, no matter how dazzling, would always invite retaliation. They had learned that the Imperium, though slow to stir, would unleash apocalyptic force when roused. And yet, they had also seen that even in the face of that fury, they could endure. Shadowsun had proven herself unbreakable, Farsight had returned from exile, and the greater good, though bloodied, had not been extinguished. The Third Sphere had reached its zenith, then been broken upon the anvil of Imperial wrath. But the Tau were not finished. Even in the ashes of Morgulath Bay, new plans were already being forged, plans that would see them hurl themselves once more into the stars. This time by means more daring, more dangerous, and more desperate than ever before. For the greater good was not a dream to be set aside, no matter how high the cost. It was a destiny, and a destiny does not wait. The fires of Morgulath Bay still smouldered when the Ethereal Council gathered in secret to ask the question no one dared to speak aloud in public. What now? Shadowsun's Third Sphere had surged like a tide and broken upon the rocks of Imperial vengeance. The Empire had endured, yes, but at a staggering cost. Entire septs had been bled dry, and though the Council's deception preserved the illusion that the Var still lived, they knew the truth, that their supreme Ethereal was gone, and with him a pillar of certainty. For a time, many urged caution, but the Tau were young, and the young are impatient. Waiting felt like death, expansion was life. And so, before their wounds had truly healed, they turned their eyes to a new gamble, the Fourth Sphere expansion. This expansion would not be like the others. The Damocles Gulf was scarred, its roots heavily fortified by Imperial bastions. The wars on Taros and Agrellion had shown that direct thrusts would always meet the mailed fist of humanity. To continue as before would be suicide. The Earthcast, ever inventive, proposed a solution. If the Gulf could not be crossed, it could be bypassed. For decades, they had studied captured Imperial technologies, dissecting warp drives with the curiosity of surgeons. Now, they unveiled their creation, the AL-38 slipstream drive. It was not true warp travel, not in the way humans hurled themselves heedlessly into the immaterium. Instead, it was meant to skim the surface of that mad ocean, diving briefly into its tides and emerging across vast distances in a blink of an eye. To a people long chained to the slow crawl of sublight, it was a revelation. Suddenly, entire fleets could leap across gulfs that had taken generations. The Council saw in it the promise of a new era, one where the Greater Good could spread beyond the Imperium's watchful borders. The Fourth Sphere would not be an expansion, it would be a leap. In 999.M41, the Great Fleet assembled. It was larger than any that had come before, a host of colonisation vessels brimming with the Earth-caste engineers, water-caste diplomats, and fire-caste cadres eager for glory. Shadowsun remained with the Third Sphere, tasked with holding the Empire's heart, but her protégés were among the fleet. At its head was Commander Shawstrike, a seasoned warrior whose name promised the precision of his aim. As the fleet gathered at the edge of Tau space, thousands of citizens looked to the stars and whispered the promise of Talvar. They believed they were watching the dawn of destiny. The order was given, the drives engaged. What followed was not destiny fulfilled, but nightmare unleashed. The moment the slipstream drives activated in unison, the fabric of reality screamed. The fleet was torn from the stars and hurled into the Imperium, not its surface, not its edge, but into its very depths. The Tau had never truly understood the warp. They had no psykers, no shamans, no history of demonic terror to teach them the dangers. Now, in an instant, they learned. The fleet was swallowed by madness, space itself twisted, corridors stretched into infinity, and time staggered like a wounded beast. Worse still were the things that came from them. From the screaming tides of unreality, demons surged. Monstrosities of claw and flame, creatures born of hate and hunger. They poured through ruptured hulls and shattered bulkheads, slaughtering with gleeful abandon. Fire warriors fought desperately, their pulse fire burning bright in the dark, but for every demon they cast down, another clawed its way through. Crute auxiliaries howled in terror, their feral instincts overwhelmed by a predator that they could not comprehend. Vespid wings were torn from the air, their resonant shrieks drowned by the laughter of the damned. Entire ships were ripped apart, their crews devoured or worse, twisted into shapes too grotesque to name. The Tau had no words for what they saw, they only called it the Great Darkness, for their minds could not grasp the true name of chaos. And then, in the heart of that despair, something strange occurred. Amid the terror, the faith of the auxiliaries, those who did know the warp, who had psycho blood in their veins, congealed into a desperate plea. The Nikasa, adrift mystics bound to the Empire, cried out. The Guavesa prayed in the old human tongue, not unto the Emperor, to the greater good. Even the Tau themselves, though blind to the warp, clung to the Talvar with such desperation that it became a beacon. And in that storm, something answered. It was described later as a many-armed light, radiant and calm amidst the shrieking tides. The survivors named it the goddess of Talvar, a warp-born entity unlike the horrors that hunted them. Whether it was truly divine, or merely a psychic gestal born from the shared faith of countless beings, none could say. What mattered was it shielded the remnants of the fleet, driving back the demons long enough for the storm to rupture once more. When the light faded, the Tau found themselves cast back into real space, but not where they intended. The fleet emerged in a region far beyond their charts, a cluster of systems that would become known as the Nemyar Atoll. Linking it to the Empire was not open space, but a miracle, a stable wormhole, a permanent bridge through the warp that the Tau named the Startide Nexus. The survivors staggered from the nightmare and into the light of new suns. The Fourth Sphere had not been annihilated entirely, though 3/4 of the fleet lay dead in the warp. What remained was battered, traumatised, but alive. Yet survival carried its own curse. The ordeal had left scars not only on the body, but on the soul. The Tau survivors of the Fourth Sphere were no longer the same people they had set out. They had seen demons, they had felt the warp's breath on their skin, and in that experience they became harsher, harder, less trusting. Many grew xenophobic, blaming alien auxiliaries for the catastrophe. They accused the Nikasa of attracting demons, the Guavesa of polluting Talvar with their human faith. In battle, they began to use allies as expendable screens, sacrificing them with cold efficiency. Some even turned their guns on auxiliaries outright, massacring entire Crute kindreds in spasms of paranoia. Commander Shawstrike, once a disciplined veteran, emerged from the ordeal embittered and unhinged. He railed against the Ethereal Council, accusing them of sending fleets to die. He distrusted even his own allies, ruling his cadres with suspicion and fear. The Fourth Sphere survivors became infamous within the Empire, heroes to some for enduring the impossible, but to many others a warning of how Talvar itself could be twisted by exposure to the galaxy's deeper horrors. And yet, for all its tragedy, the Fourth Sphere left a legacy that could not be ignored. The Startide Nexus was real, it was stable, and it opened into the cluster of a system rich with resources and worlds ripe for colonisation. The Ethereals seized upon this discovery, hailing it a miracle of the greater good. They quietly suppressed the reports of the warp ordeal, presenting the return of the fleet as a triumph rather than trauma. Publicly, the Fourth Sphere was celebrated. Privately, it was whispered of in dread. Thus the tragedy of the Fourth Sphere became a paradox. It was both a disaster and a gift, both a scar and a doorway. The Empire could not deny the opportunity of the Nexus, nor could they erase the stain of what had been endured. The survivors carried their ghosts into every battle, their paranoia seeping into doctrine, their brutality unsettling even their kin. The greater good had been tested in fire of the warp, and though it had survived, it had not emerged uncorrupted. The Ethereals looked to the Nexus and declared the future lay beyond it. The Fifth Sphere expansion would follow, and this time it would not stumble blindly. But for those who had stared into the warp's abyss, the future was no promise. It was a warning. The greater good had walked into the storm and come back alive, but never again whole. The Fourth Sphere expansion was remembered by its survivors not as a triumph but as a scar. Ships lost to the warp, demons that tore through hulls, and comrades twisted into horrors that no tower had words for. All of this lingered in the eyes of those who returned. Yet the Ethereal Council, masters of the narrative, did not permit despair to take root in the Empire's heart. Publicly, the Fourth was celebrated as miracle, its survivors hailed as heroes, its wormhole, the Startide Nexus, declared the greatest discovery in the Empire's history. And in a sense, it was true. For the Nexus opened not into empty stars, but into a cluster of worlds rich with ore, fertile plains, and skies unclouded by Imperial banners. A door had been unlocked, and the Ethereals were determined that the greater good would stride through it, no matter the price they already paid. The Fifth Sphere expansion was not born of hesitation, but of fury. The Council declared it would be larger, swifter, and more ambitious than anything before it. Where the Fourth had been a fleet alone, the Fifth would be an empire in motion, entire septs seeded through the Nexus in one sweeping surge. Shadowsun, still scarred by the loss of Magulath Bay, was placed at its head. To her fell the burden of redeeming the Empire's pride, of proving that the greater good could not only endure disaster but be reborn stronger. The preparations were immense. Earth-cast shipyards worked without pause, forging flotillas of colony ships, battlesuits, and star forts. Fire-cast cadres drilled endlessly, their doctrines refined with every scar from past wars. Water-cast envoys rehearsed their speeches, learning the languages of potential allies, ready to spread the creed of unity. Even the auxiliaries swelled in number, their loyalty brought with gifts of technology and shared survival. Kroot kindreds pled new legions, Vespid swarms hummed at the promise of plunder, and the Guevesa regiments multiplied as human defectors from the Imperium sought a better life. This was not an expedition, it was a tide, and at its crest stood Commander Shadowsun, her white-armoured battlesuit gleaming like a star. In 999.M41, as the galaxy convulsed with greater storms, the fall of Cadia, the tearing of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Fifth Sphere surged through the Nexus. Entire systems fell into its orbit in a matter of months. Some worlds, long neglected by the Imperium, opened their gates willingly, seduced by the promise of clean water, abundant harvests, and defences that did not bleed them with endless tithes. Others resisted, and there Shadowsun's patience gave way to precision. She struck not with drawn-out sieges, but with lightning Mont'au thrusts, seizing command hubs, orbital relays, and manufactoria before the enemy could marshal a response. Resistance collapsed swiftly in her wake. The expansion spread like wildfire, new septs were founded, Devis, Elysier, Fascia Secundus, each rising as hubs of culture and strength. The Empire's borders swelled in ways once unthinkable. To Tau citizens, it felt like destiny fulfilled. At last, the Empire was not a cluster of fragile stars on the edge of extinction, but a growing constellation that rivaled the domains of the oldest powers, or so it seemed. For Shadowsun knew better. She had studied the Imperium too closely, fought too long against its vengeful claws, to believe that silence meant safety. Humanity was distracted, yes. The Great Rift had torn their empire in two, demons swarmed from its depths, and civil war gnawed at their borders. But the Imperium was vast, inexhaustible, and vindictive. Their counterblow would come, whether in years or decades, and when it did, it would burn. Shadowsun pressed the expansion with relentless urgency, determined to fortify the Nexus worlds before the hammer fell. The Fifth Sphere was not merely conquest, it was transformation. The Tau had seen the galaxy's horrors in the Fourth, and they no longer saw allies with the same naivety. The Firecast became harsher in doctrine, less trusting of auxiliaries, quicker to enforce obedience with fire. The survivors of the Fourth Sphere carried their bitterness into these new wars, and their paranoia bled into the Empire at large. Some whispered that Shadowsun herself grew colder, her strategies precise but merciless. She spoke less of harmony and more of necessity, less of persuasion and more of inevitability. If the greater good was once a promise, in the Fifth Sphere it became a mandate. The battles of the Fifth Sphere were fierce. On the ice world of Nimbossa, fire-cast cadres fought against Astromilitaran regiments entrenched in glacial fortresses, their pulse rivals clashing with lasgun volleys in whiteout storms. On the jungle moon of Dover, crew packs hunted Space Marine scouts through tangled canopies, devouring their fallen to strengthen themselves for the next ambush. In orbit above Dal Rin, Tau starfleets clashed with Imperial Navy battle groups in duels of railgun salvos and torpedo spreads, wreckage burning in the void like false constellations. Each victory was hard won, each loss a reminder of how thin the line of survival truly was. But the Fifth Sphere also brought triumphs that no other expansion had matched. Entire human regiments defected en masse, their commanders declaring loyalty to the greater good rather than a distant emperor they had never seen. Entire star systems turned, weary of imperial neglect and eager for Tau technology. In these moments, the Empire saw the vision of Tau Var vindicted, not through conquest alone, but through choice. The Watercast broadcast these victories across the Empire, reminding citizens that even in war, the greater good could inspire, not merely compel. Yet for all its brilliance, the Fifth Sphere was haunted. Reports filtered back of commanders breaking under pressure, of auxiliaries butchered in suspicious accidents, of survivors of the Fourth Sphere spreading their paranoia like infection. And above all loomed the knowledge that their triumphs were fragile. The Cicatrix Maledignum had split the galaxy, but already Imperial counteroffensives gathered in the shadows. Shadowsun knew it was only a matter of time before the storm broke again. Still, the expansion pressed forward, for to halt was to admit weakness, and the Ethereals, ever unyielding, declared the Fifth Sphere proof that the greater good was not a dream, not a philosophy alone, but a destiny carved in fire. The Empire had survived the warp, survived demons, survived Orks and Tyranids and the wrath of mankind itself. Now it had crossed the threshold of fear and claimed a new frontier. But in quiet moments, away from the eyes of her cadres, Shadowsun allowed herself no illusions. She remembered the ruins of Murgalath Bay, the cries of civilians beneath orbital fire, the endless corpses of fire warriors who had believed the greater good would protect them. She knew the Imperium's silence was temporary, the eye of the storm, and she knew that when the storm returned, the Fifth Sphere would not be judged by how many worlds it had claimed, but by whether it could survive the full weight of humanity's wrath. For now, though, the Tau allowed themselves to dream. The Fifth Sphere was not tragedy but rebirth, a declaration that even after walking into the warp itself, their destiny burned unbroken. The greater good had endured, had adapted, had risen anew, and as the banners of fresh seps unfurled across the alien skies, the Empire whispered to itself the creed that had carried it from the Mont'au to the stars, that unity, however scarred, would one day bind the galaxy itself. Yet even as those words spread, shadows lengthened, for in the far reaches of the Nexus, a new kind of darkness stirred, one the Tau did not yet understand, and one that would test whether the Tau Val was light enough to pierce the night of a galaxy at war with itself. The Tau were born on a single harsh world of copper deserts and knife-edged mountains, a species nearly lost to their own violence. Now, less than 6 millennia later, they stand as an empire that dares to claim a future. They have fought Orks, Imperium, Tyranids, Necrons, even demons whose existence they once denied. They have endured betrayal, disaster and near extinction, yet still their banners fly across the stars, still their commanders sharpen their doctrines, still their Ethereals whisper of destiny. The question that hangs above them is not whether they will fight again, it is whether the greater good will endure long enough to reshape the galaxy, or whether it will be broken on the anvil of an age that devours all empires. At their core, the Tau remain what they have always been, young. Compared to the Imperium's 10,000 years of stagnation, compared to the Necrons' eons of slumber, compared to the Orks' endless cycles of war, the Tau are children among giants. This youth is both their weakness and their strength. They lack the numbers to drown their foes in bodies, the fleets to rival the Imperium's endless armadas, the psychic might to contend with the warp-born sorceries of chaos. But they also lack the chains of tradition that have bound so many others. Where the Imperium clings to dogma, the Tau innovate. Where Orks revel in endless slaughter, the Tau adapt. Where Necrons and Eldar are shackled by ancient curses, the Tau dream of tomorrow. It is that dream that propels them ever outward. The Fifth Sphere has already carried them farther than they once thought possible, across the wormhole of the Startide Nexus, into the Namyar Atoll. Colonies bloom on worlds that would have been death traps to their ancestors, defended by fleets that grow sleeker and deadlier with every campaign. Auxiliaries continue to swell their ranks, more Kroot kindreds pledge themselves, more Vespid hives take the communion helms, more Gwevesa regiments abandon the Imperium's cruelty for the promise of the greater good. Every alliance, every set founded, is another step towards the Ethereals' promise. And yet, every step outward brings new dangers. The Cicatrix Maledictum has torn the galaxy in half, and its tides spill demons into real space with horrors the Tau can barely name. Already, the Force Sphere survivors whisper warnings that their leaders prefer to silence. Warnings of entities that cannot be bargained with, of nightmares that laugh at pulse fire and railguns alike. The Tyranids, though beaten at Gorgon, still prowl the void, their splinter feet testing the Tau defences again and again. Ork wars rise like weeds in every unclaimed system, drawn to the Tau's growing power as predators scent prey. And above all looms the Imperium of Man, still vast, still unyielding, still vowing that humanity must stand alone. The Imperium's crusades will come again, of that Shadowsun has no doubt. Already she tightens defences, layers Kayun upon Kayun, knowing that the hammer of retribution may fall at any moment. But there are cracks even within her empire. Farsight still lives, still defies the Ethereals, still carries the Dawnblade into wars on the far frontier. His enclave stands as a mirror of the Tau, proof that unity can exist without the ethereal command, proof that another vision of the Tau Va might be possible. For now, his forces remain small compared to the Empire, but his legend grows, whispered by fire warriors who wonder whether their guides are shepherds or gallowers. The question he embodies: what is the true nature of the greater good? Will it not vanish? The Ethereals themselves remain shrouded in mystery. Their authority is absolute, their presence compelling, their decisions beyond question. But shadows lengthen around them. The lie of the Own-Var's survival still holds, yet lies cannot endure forever. Rumours spread of manipulation, of secrets withheld, of the strange compulsion that binds the Tau to their guidance. If that trust is ever broken, the Empire may discover that its greatest strength, the unity of the Tau Va, was built upon foundations more fragile than they believed. Still the Tau endure, and endurance itself is rare in a galaxy that chews through civilizations without pause. Theirs is not a power measured in raw numbers or ancient might, but in persistence. Every time the galaxy throws them into the furnace, they emerge scarred but alive, adapting, learning, hardening. They may not have fallen to despair, not yet. They believe still that the greater good is not a dream, but a destiny, that one day harmony can triumph over the chaos that has ruled since the stars first burned. Beyond the borders of their empire, the galaxy is vast and merciless, but the Tau are no longer blind to its horrors. They now know of the warp and its predators, of demons and their lies. They know of the Imperium's fury, the Orks' hunger, the Tyranids' endless swarm. They know the Necrons sleep beneath countless worlds, and that the Eldar play games of fate older than the Tau civilization itself. They know, and yet they march onward. The future is not certain. Perhaps the Tau will be crushed beneath an Imperial crusade too massive to resist. Perhaps they'll be devoured by a Tyranid fleet larger than Gorgon. Perhaps they'll tear themselves apart, divided between the Ethereals and Farsight, between obedience and doubt. But perhaps, just perhaps, they will endure long enough to outlast their enemy's stagnation. The Imperium decays, the Eldar dwindle, the Orks brawl without end, the Tyranids consume without purpose. Only the Tau build, only the Tau dream of a future greater than themselves. In their language, Tau Va means more than the greater good. It means the path, the harmony, the vision of tomorrow where all are united, where war is no longer the galaxy's only truth. Whether that vision is possible in a universe so cruel is uncertain, but the Tau believe it. They fight for it, they bleed for it, and as long as they endure, the dream endures with them. And from the ashes of the Mont'au to the edges of the Startide Nexus, the Tau have proven one truth. They will not vanish quietly. They will reach, they will adapt, they will fight, they will survive. The galaxy may laugh at their youth, may dismiss their philosophy, may crush their seps and burn their colonies, but the Tau will rise again, as they always have. And so the story of the Tau Empire is not one of inevitability, but of defiance. In a universe where despair is the only constant, they cling to hope. In a galaxy where survival is rare, they build. In an age where empires collapse, they dare to dream of something greater. Beyond their borders lies only war, only ruin, only endless night. But the Tau march forward regardless, their banners bright against the dark, their pulse fire defiant against the void. They may not know what tomorrow holds, but they know this: the greater good will carry them into it, and in a galaxy that's forgotten hope, that is the future worth fighting for. You have received the transmission of Dominissimo Voxlore. The saga of the Tau Empire continues, written in fire, bound in unity, and carried ever onward by the greater good. Mark your allegiance, strike the seal of subscription, and join the ranks of those who seek the truth of the 41st millennium. Until the next broadcast, hold fast to your creed, for the galaxy offers no mercy, only strength that we forge together. This is Dominissimo, and this channel carries the law of the greater good,